Hi, Bill.
Hello.
Hiya.
I've been kidnapped. I'm being held hostage against my will somewhere in Dubai.
Mate, well, thank you for joining me today. Thank you. I know you've got a tight schedule, so much appreciated. Bill, I want to ask you about your early childhood. Like, when did you realize you wanted to? Like, when did it drop that you knew you wanted to be, documenting dance music, and when was it? Tell me some of the early days that sort of led you there.
Okay, so the idea of me doing all of the things that I do now when I was a kid were really fanciful. I grew up in like a northern industrial working class environment. I went to school on a council estate. There was very little aspiration involved in what I was doing when I was a kid. My three best mates that I grew up with are a bricklayer, a plasterer, and a steel worker. So, I grew up in a very industrial environment. But I became a chef, and that's sort of what got me traveling. So I trained as a chef at a local college, and then I moved down to London to work there. And from there, I moved to Switzerland and worked there, and I worked back in London. And so once I started traveling, I'd always been like a music fanatic. Originally, my big passion was punk rock. I moved to London in 1977. I'd seen the Sex Pistols play, and I wanted to be at the epicenter of punk rock. That's kind of why I moved to London. And then gradually over the years, that kind of mutated and changed. And I really got into dance music through punk, weirdly. So I was really into bands like the Gang of Four and A Certain Ratio and 23 Skidoo and Street Back and all of these kind of bands. I was going to see them play live. And in interviews, they'd be like name-checking Fela Kuti and Cameo and all of these black artists that I'd never heard of. And because I was a fan of them, I thought, okay, I need to find out who Fela Kuti is. I need to find out who Cameo are. And, so it was kind of a gradual thing. So I didn't really start going out to clubs properly until I was maybe like 21, 22. So like the early 80s. But even then, the idea of sort of being involved in music was a hobby. I was a chef, and that was my hobby. But I started a band. I started a post-punk band in like the end of 81, 82. We got a record deal. We got played on John Peel. We did a little bit of touring. And the band were great. I mean, I've got to say, I was the worst part of the band. I was like the singer who couldn't sing and a percussionist who wasn't that good at percussion. And I was with a bunch of really, really hot musicians. So I was the kind of weak spot in the band, but I just loved being involved in music. And the idea of someone like me with my modest amount of talent being involved in music was like amazing. But once I'd done that, I got the bug and it never really left me. So that was like 40 years ago. And gradually I got more and more involved in music. It became more and more important to me. And when Acid House happened, I'd already been DJing a little bit. But a lot of what I do now really comes from record collecting. I think the thing was I was a massive record collector from the age of about 10. And so I wasn't interested in being a DJ, but people knew that I had a lot of records. So they started asking me to come and play because I just had a good record collection. So my interest in DJing really came from that. I had no particular desire to be a DJ to start with. I was just someone that had a lot of records. But then once I started DJing, I started thinking about the records that I bought in a different way, about how much impact a track could have on a dance floor compared to listening to it at home or on my headphones. And that kind of completely changed my perspective of how I looked at music, how I searched for music and how I found music.
Was there any formal journalism studying or like, yeah?
Okay, so I left school. I was 15 when I left school with no qualifications. So I didn't do very well at school. Academically, I wasn't thick, but I was just a bit demotivated. When you get educated in an environment where violence, football, and music are kind of more important than geography and physics and chemistry, it is a bit of a demoting environment. And if you know anything about Britain, it's very segregated between people that are educated in private schools and people that are educated in state schools. There's a big kind of difference between the two.
I guess music was very inspiring.
So music was important to me, but the idea that I could make a living from music was so remote when I was at school that I didn't even think about it. I mean, it just, if you'd have told a 15-year-old me that in 40 years' time I'd have been making a living from music, I would, there's just no way I would have even been able to comprehend that.
Yeah.
So I did go back to college to do some A-levels. And I did go back to university as a mature student, but I actually dropped out. By the time I went to university, I realized that I was just a bit too old to do that. And I just needed to just get on with my life and do the things that I was doing because I was kind of doing okay. So no, I don't have any formal qualifications as a writer whatsoever.
But the music industry and dance music really is such a DIY thing. Like you kind of create you create a work,
Well, I'd come from that punk rock aesthetic of like having a go. What I loved about punk rock was it was a whole group of people who were incompetent, but were prepared to have a go at playing the bass or writing or promoting or doing graphic design, whatever it was.
Yeah.
The idea of having a go was suddenly in the air in the UK, and that had a massive impact on a whole generation of people. And to me, when Acid House happened, it was like black punk rock. It was like all of these kids in Chicago were like black kids that couldn't play their instruments, that didn't know how a synthesizer worked, that didn't know how to promote a club. And they were essentially doing what we'd been doing with punk rock in the late 70s. And so that really, really struck a chord with me. It was like, okay, this is really similar to punk. And loads of people like Andrew Weatherall and Chris Needs, there were loads of people that have been involved in punk rock that started DJing or started making records or whatever. So the idea of having a go at things was in the air. And I've always been one of those people that it's not enough to be a fan of something. I want to like kind of pull it apart and see how it works. And so I always felt like I might be able to write because I read a lot. I was really interested. I read all the music magazines and I was obsessed with kind of different music writers and I read a lot of novels and stuff like that. And really writing is about reading. I think good writers come from people that read a lot. And I read a lot and somehow I've managed to over the years find my voice, find who I am as a writer. But I really did that working on the job, as it were. So I started getting published stuff into, first of all, football magazines, because I was involved in a football fanzine in the late 80s. And then after that, music magazines as well. I got a big break from a guy called Nick Gordon-Brown, who was assistant editor at Mixmag. He was a fan of the football fanzine that I wrote for. And he and I got talking one day. He called the fanzine because he wanted some football stuff in Mixmag. And he and I hit it off, and we're still really good friends now. But he was the person that kind of brought me into the music industry as a writer, really. But I was just really writing about my passions.
Yeah. Look, I want to say thank you for the
saving my life.
Yeah, exactly.
I know you look like you were drowning. I just fortunately had my swimming trunks with me, and we were just, we were lucky.
No, first I want to say thank you for the books and the things that you've done, because I think they're very important pieces of history and documenting the history of dance music. And all these stories are, especially today, it's such a huge industry, and this information is paramount for people to understand where this all came from and where it's heading. And I also wanted to ask you about your thoughts how the landscape's changed in terms of like now being that it's such a big industry that people are very entrepreneurial and there is a particular mindset and will and there's a drive that is required to be able to be successful and create a career in this industry. And we've seen that now by looking at looking back, we know what's required and the kind of work that's involved, and there's a lot of work involved. Now, dance music is historically, has a history of partying and drugs, which being in a really good mindset, it's kind of hard to do that, right? So how, like today, and especially in Gen Z now, is people are becoming a lot more healthier and a lot more active in mental health and all these sort of things too. Does this have an impact? What are your thoughts on that? Because the early days was about hedonism, and it seems like there's a different level of hedonism. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, people have been getting off their heads for thousands of years. Let's be honest. It's like, we're not doing anything that people haven't done before. Sure. So, whether it's drinking reindeer piss 2,000 years ago in Finland or do you know what I mean?
Sure.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest the reason we stopped roaming the plains and actually cultivating things was actually to produce things that made alcohol as much as it was to produce crops for food. So, we humans have been experimenting with psychedelic drugs and natural psychedelic drugs for thousands of years, and using religious ceremonies which involve magic mushrooms and peyote and all kinds of other things. Yeah. So what we're doing is merely another version of that in a modern context. Yeah. So people are going to want to do that, to experiment for as long as there are people and young people. I've got a daughter who's about to turn 18. And she's at that stage now where she wants to know about all of these things and she wants to experiment herself. And so you can't really say, well, we've done it, we've had all the fun, it's now outlawed. They're going to want to try things just as much as we do. Yeah. I think the point is, if you want to survive in dance music, you have to take a little bit more of a sanguine view, because so many of people I know and really good friends of mine have not made it this far because they had problems with drug abuse. Yes. They had problems with alcohol. My father was an alcoholic who died young because of his addiction. So I'm well aware of, all of the pitfalls. But I think, when you get to my age, you have to kind of but slow down, quite frankly, if you want to survive. You can't live that life over and over again and expect to survive. Yeah. But if you're 18, I don't think you can really kind of like be wagging your finger and saying, well, it's dangerous and you can't do it. I think people are going to experiment. Yeah. And all music, when you think about it, has really been driven by different types of stimulants over many, many decades. Jazz in the 1920s, 100 years ago, people were smoking spliffs. So it's not a new thing. What we did in 1988 or whenever it's not new. People have been doing that for many, many years, thousands of years. It might have been that they were dancing around a campfire 2,000 years ago with a witch doctor, taking peyote and praying to the gods. I mean, what's the difference between that and dancing to a DJ Pierre record? Yes. It's the same kind of thing. Absolutely. The books and the work and the research you've done over the years and that you've got, what were the intentions back then? I mean, now, these are, I believe, very important information for people to have access to. So I think one of the things that, Frank, my partner, and I met when we were living in New York. So we both actually grew up about 30 miles from each other in Lincolnshire in England, but we knew about each other before I moved to New York, but we'd never actually met. And we met in New York. We immediately hit it off, and we started talking about the incredible stories that people would tell in New York. So that the initial impetus was really the kind of oral history that existed in New York. We were just so blown away by how much information people stored in their memories about the Loft, the Paradise Garage, 12 West, the Flamingo, all of these incredible clubs in New York. And that's what we wanted to document to start with. And our research grew from that, really. We thought, well, if we'd done that, what about all of this other stuff? Northern Soul and Acid House in Chicago and techno in Detroit and all of these other kind of styles of music. And it always seemed to us that dance music was quite badly researched when we were first writing about it. And we wanted to put a book together that kind of brought all of these stories together to say, here's our history. Here's the history of the thing that we're interested in, because there were thousands of books about the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and all of these, iconic rock acts, but there was hardly anything about dance music. And dancing is such a fundamental part of most people's being. Humans dance. I mean, it's a fundamental part of mental well-being and all kinds of stuff, and a way of communities gathering together, and there's all kinds of reasons why it's important. And it just seemed to us like a really obvious thing to want to write about. Publishers didn't feel quite the same way. They weren't as enthusiastic, and at that time there weren't people falling over themselves to publish that book. So it's changed now, because I think people do realize that all of that stuff has some cultural value
and an impact on society and music, and as music history as we know it. Like it's been part of the fabric of even pop music today. It's like
absolutely, I would say a lot of pop music is derived from kind of dance music's roots in a lot of way. A lot of pop music is based on like house music and techno and all kinds of
stuff. And it's only now though that like, why do you think it's taken so long to get acknowledgement now or awareness? I mean, it's a $7 billion a year industry now, electronic music, and it's only now becoming.
Yeah, I think when we first started writing about it, it was still seen as more of a kind of outlaw culture.
That's right, yeah.
Because so much of the reporting in the mainstream press revolved around drug taking rather than the actual culture of dance music. I think it was still seen as. I mean, you look at the people that are in Parliament, and they're so divorced in many ways. I'm using the UK as an example, but I'm sure it's exactly the same in all of the other countries around the world.
100%.
That the middle class white men in suits don't understand what black kids in London are doing, and therefore, when they don't understand it, they try and stop it. I mean, that's kind of. That's how
we've seen it before.
It's not new. Let's be honest. It's been happening for decades and decades and decades. So I think it was seen as a kind of outlaw culture. And there's always been two strands in dance music. There's the kind of the entrepreneurial part of it, which is about kind of pushing new boundaries and making things bigger. But also, I think there's an element of protest about dance music as well. Not necessarily in a overtly political kind of way, but there's certainly an anti-authoritarian streak in dance music, because that idea of wanting to be underground, of wanting to throw parties in places where you shouldn't throw parties, that to me is very much it's a political act, whether the people are consciously making it or seeing it as a political act. I remember when I interviewed Fabio, the drum and bass DJ, Fabio and Groove Rider. He totally understood what was happening in the late 80s as far as he was concerned, it was anti-Thatcherite. Because she'd been saying there's no society, and here were all of these kids gathering together in these little communities and creating their own new alternative societies. Yeah. And so he was totally like, fuck Thatcher. This is what the real world is like. These people, these are my people. And that's what I really felt at the time as well, was like, you know, we'd had a Tory government for decades, and Acid House seemed to me an escape from that.
Yeah.
And when you look at what the Black community and the gay community and the Latin community in New York were doing in the 1970s, it was still very much the same kind of vibe. Again, not necessarily overtly political, not necessarily consciously knowing that they were or acting against what the government would want them to do. But I think, you know, you look at disco, and that was really quite a political movement.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying before, it's all very punk rock, you know?
Absolutely. You know, so that's what's funny about it. The more that you delve into it and the more people we interviewed, the more you felt that you were almost telling the same story over and over again in different communities and among different people.
Now, I've noticed you've done a bit of a brand change, like with your show. Like DJ History was a weekly for so many years, and again, thank you for that too. I've been listening to that. Came out on Fridays, and it would be like this 30-minute, 20-minute sort of take on your new music that you discovered that week. But now you've kind of done a bit of a shift, and it's now a podcast that you're interviewing people in the music industry and capturing their stories. When did this happen? And now it's called your music show is called the Bill Brewster radio show podcast, and then you've got DJ History as well. So tell me a bit about what's happening there.
So the reason I started doing it as the Bill Brewster podcast was because during the pandemic, I didn't have any income, and I was trying to find ways of sort of earning a bit of money, basically. Yeah. So I brought it into behind the paywall with Patreon and Mixcloud, and sort of said, if you want to listen to this, you need to subscribe to it now, because I've been doing it, you know, free to air for 10 years or something like that. I mean, I'm up to episode 700 nearly, so I've been doing it a long time. I think I started it in 2009, and I've been doing it weekly ever since. So the DJ History podcast that I do now is just talking to people that I think are interesting about their lives, about DJing, about DJ culture, and about music and their love of music. So I started that in November last year. And I've done, I don't know, I've done about 5 so far, 4 or 5.
And you switched the old name to that.
Yeah, so that now the DJ History podcast is a discussion, a one-to-one discussion with a different person.
Yeah, the website looks great. Like,
thank you.
Yeah, it looks really good.
So the idea is to just really talk about with people that I think are interesting. Not necessarily they're not necessarily mega famous or anything, but people that I've known over the years or I've met, and I've found them to have lots of interesting opinions, or that I know they're very thoughtful. So the idea is to get away from not necessarily speaking to famous people or famous DJs, but people that have something to say. And that means more to me as someone that's interested in DJ culture than necessarily interviewing, you know, Armin van Buuren or whatever. I know he's enormously successful or whatever, but that element of DJ culture doesn't really interest me. I'm interested in people who are thinking about what it is and what it is they do. And because as a journalist, you have to think a lot more than the average DJ does about your job and what you do. You kind of have to pull it apart a little bit. It's like being a mechanic, isn't it? You kind of, you know, as normal drivers of cars, just get in a car and drive it. But a mechanic has to know how and why that car is moving. Yeah. And it's the same for me. I have to kind of deconstruct what it is that DJs do and what their motivations are and what they think about it and how we could improve it and what the future looks like, all of those kind of things. I suppose that's what I'm looking for when I interview someone.
Sure. And was it difficult to change all the album art covers from all your previous episodes? Like, there's a massive like catalog there. Was it how to change from the original artwork, say on SoundCloud, for example? You had your image of DJ History, and now you've rebranded it. How did you do that? Like, because if anyone knows how to like go in and change your artwork on SoundCloud,
The stuff that was already up, I just left it as is. Really.
Right, okay.
But I started using a couple of different designers.
Got it. And it looks great.
Stuff.
It looks really cool.
Thank you.
Very cool. And you've got some new books coming out, or a new book coming out.
Yeah,
Tell us a bit about that.
We did an updated edition of Last Night DJ Saved My Life, which came out in the UK in English July last year. Going to come out in paperback next year. We're just doing a new Japanese translation of that as well. So that's coming out next year as well, I think. We've got ideas for, I did mention off camera, we've got this idea for a book, but I don't really want to talk about it until we've actually signed a deal and we're writing it. Because I always feel like if you talk about these things before you've done them, you're kind of jinxing them a little bit. And I don't want to talk about something until I'm actually physically writing it.
I understand.
But Frank and I are always working on ideas. Basically, he's my best friend. He was the best man at my wedding. I was the best man at his wedding. He's my daughter's godfather.
Yeah.
We're first and foremost, me and him are friends.
Great.
So we talk about all kinds of stuff every week. Some of it's related to DJ history. Some of it's related to the party that we do together, Low Life. Yeah. And some of it is not related to any of that. And we're just talking shit, basically. So, yeah, he's basically my mate.
Yeah. And where can people find everything about Bill Brewster now online?
Well, a good place to start is djhistory.com, which is the website that Frank and I run together. Mm-hmm. And I guess if you just Google my name, I'm on Twitter as @djhistory. I'm on Instagram as Bill_Brewster. And just Google my name. I'm not that bloody hard to find. I'm not exactly elusive.
Well, thanks again, Bill. And it's an honor to finally meet you as well. And also, while we'll get it on camera, you were very helpful. I don't know if you remember. I emailed you a couple of years ago, actually, in the beginning of the pandemic, and asking you some questions about podcasting, and before I started to delve into it, and you were so helpful. So again, thank you. I don't know if you remember that email, but
I don't remember that email. But what I do remember, and it's important to me, is remembering what it was like as a kid in Grimsby who had no contacts and didn't know anyone, and feeling kind of like, how do you find out about this stuff? So I've always made a point of anyone emailing me to try and help, because I remember what that felt like, of feeling that you were kind of maroon somewhere. And it's the same with students. I always kind of do student interviews and things like that. I think it's kind of important to show people that the roots into our industry and stuff like that. And it, I want to see more young kids, more women, and more people getting involved in the industry.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you. It was very helpful.
My pleasure.
See you tonight.
Absolutely. Be there or be square.